Well, good morning again, church family. We are taking a break from our series going through the book of Acts today, and we're going to take a look at another story from Scripture, a famous story that comes from Matthew chapter 14 today. Have you ever felt like you were a little in over your head? I think it's one of those common feelings, one of those things that probably all of us experience in one way or another sometime in life, if not many times throughout life, the feeling of being in over our head. I know I've felt it a number of times when I'm starting something new, whether that is jumping into a new job that I've never done before, moving to a new city, and sort of being overwhelmed by the surroundings and the responsibilities and feeling like I don't know if I'm up to this task. We can feel it when we started a new school or a new year of school, or maybe even just like a project around the house, something you thought would be easy to fix or to do. And it turns out it's a little more complicated than you anticipated, and we feel in over our head. Sometimes relationships are that way. Maybe when we got married, if you're married, you realize marriage can be more complicated than you expected, or having kids certainly can make us feel like we're in over our head. These days, many of us might feel that way just from the looming uncertainty that almost defines this year. The looming uncertainty of what's going to happen. How long is this going to last, and all of the things that go along with it. And for some of us, there's other people that might look to us for guidance in the midst of all of that uncertainty, and we can feel in over our head. Well, if you've ever had that feeling for whatever reason, then I think this story is for you. It's a story that comes from Matthew chapter 14. It is during what I think is probably the height of Jesus' ministry, in the sense of the number of people that are coming to him, coming to be healed, coming to hear his teachings, to see what this guy is all about. It is during this time that he has the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus takes a small amount of food, a boy's lunch, and he uses it to feed more than 5,000 people all at once. It's an amazing story. After he finishes feeding them, he dismisses himself and he goes off to pray, to be alone for a while. And the disciples, they get into a boat and they start to sail across the Sea of Galilee to the other side. As the disciples are sailing, a storm rises, and it's late at night. It's completely dark outside, and the storm gets really bad. In fact, the text says that the waves are beating the boat. The original language actually says that the waves are tormenting the boat. It's a bad storm. And as I said, it's the middle of the night. It's completely dark out there. The only light that they would have would be from the stars and the moon, and in a storm, those are probably covered. So really, the light that they have is probably lightning flashes. And you can imagine them trying to keep things steady in this storm as the waves are tormenting them and the lightning flashes, and one of them looks out across the water and they think they see something on the water. The lightning flashes again, and whatever it is, it's a little bit closer, and they look. Is that a person? Is that a person? And the lightning flashes again, and the figure is closer to them on the water, and the lightning flashes again, and the figure is closer to them, still on the water. What would you think? They respond in the way that people would respond to a situation like that, and they say, "It's a ghost." And they're terrified. And then, amazingly, that figure moving closer to them on the water calls out to them and says, "Don't be afraid. It's me. It's Jesus, walking on the water in this storm towards this boat that is being tormented by the waves." And Peter responds to Jesus, and we're going to look at the way that Peter responds and what happens here. It says in Matthew 14, verse 28, Peter answered Jesus, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Why did you doubt? The question that Jesus asks Peter in this moment is sort of the focus of the lesson today. Why did you doubt? Have you ever had those moments of doubt? Peter did here. And you can always imagine what Jesus is saying to him and saying, how could you, Peter, doubt Jesus? I mean, after all, they've experienced so much together. Peter has witnessed with his own eyes amazing things. He's seen Jesus heal everything from physical deformity to demon possession. He's heard teachings that were described to be like none other that anybody had heard. Just hours prior to this, he had witnessed Jesus feed 5,000 people with one sack lunch. And now Peter himself, in being out on that water, walking towards Jesus, Peter can look down at his own feet and see that there is nothing but water underneath him. That he is defying the laws of physics by the power of Jesus. And it's in that moment, while Jesus is doing something incredible right there in that moment, Peter has a wave of doubt. Pardon the pun. He has a wave of doubt that washes over him. It's unexpected. Doubt that comes out of nowhere. And I would bet that some of you have experienced something like that. Not that you've walked on water, but you've had this wave of doubt that seems to come from nowhere. After all that you've seen, after all the time that you've spent with Jesus yourself, where did that doubt come from? I think Peter shows us that it can trip the best of us. I mean, Peter was, after all, one of Jesus' closest friends in the world. And even he got caught by this moment of doubt. Have you ever been there? Where doubt, maybe it's not that you are questioning whether God is there or whether Jesus is there, but at times it can feel like, based on our surrounding and our experiences that we're going through, based on the storm that we are in, sometimes it can be hard to continue to trust that Jesus really, really has you in that moment. Like, we still believe in him, but it's hard to really, really believe like he's got us in the most difficult of times. We can look at this challenging thing that surrounds us, this storm in our own life, and we can say, how is this good for me? How is this good for anyone? How can this be part of your plan? And it's hard to keep on trusting in that moment. It's hard to trust that this is the path that I should stay on, that I should keep going through this storm, that I should keep trying to follow Jesus when it's so hard. It can be hard to convince ourselves, even just for a moment, that we should keep pressing forward. And in all of that, Jesus might say to us, why did you doubt? And the answer might be that we just lost perspective, even for a moment. Often as a result, like Peter in this situation, of fear. Fear can overwhelm our perspective. Now, there can be a number of things, I think, that cause us doubt, but what we see in this story is a powerful example of one of those things, which is the way that fear affects us. Fear is powerful. The text says that Peter saw the wind and he was afraid. And that's when he started to sink. He saw the wind and he was afraid. And I can imagine it going something like this. He's focused on Jesus. He's walking towards Jesus, and then a stronger gust of wind kind of knocks him off balance. Or those waves that were tormenting the boat are sort of hard to keep your balance on. And he stumbles to one side perhaps, and in that moment he takes his eyes off of Jesus, and then he notices how strong the winds are again. And it causes a response of fear, and maybe he had in his mind, I can't do this. I can't do this. And he has doubt. That word doubt in Greek, in the original language of the New Testament, is distazo. And the meaning of the word has the connotation of your mind trying to go in two directions at the same time. Distazo, to go two directions at the same time. In the English language, we have a phrase where we say, I am having second thoughts. And it's kind of similar to that in meaning. I'm having second thoughts. And so Peter, in this moment, he's going towards Jesus, but the wind, the fear causes him to lose perspective, and he has second thoughts. Fear is powerful to produce that effect. One of my favorite writings of C.S. Lewis is a book called The Screwtape Letters. It's a fictional account of one demon giving advice to another demon on how to go about tempting the human race away from Jesus. And Screwtape is the name of the demon writing the letters. And Screwtape refers to Jesus as the enemy when he writes. And he gives some advice to his nephew on how to go about tempting the humans. And he says this in part of the book. He says, there's nothing like suspense and anxiety for barricading a human's mind against the enemy, Jesus. He, Jesus, wants men to be concerned with what they do. Our business as demons is to keep them thinking about what will happen to them. Just keep us focused on what might happen to me. I've got to stay safe. And keep being obsessed with these things. What might happen to me is the core of fear. It's a powerful thing to push us in various directions. Fear is primal. It's built into our operating system. It's part of who we are. It's part of God's design for us. And on some level, fear is a good thing. It's kind of like one of the warning lights on the dashboard of your car. It's like it's intended to bring about safety, to cause us to notice where danger is and to do something to correct it. It is part of our survival, threat detection, and it overrides, when it pops up, it overrides everything else so that we can get to safety. And the way that it overrides everything in us sometimes creates some funny reactions. And so we can watch videos of people who are being frightened. If somebody jumps out at them and they lose all control. They just scream and they lose control of their bodies and these kinds of things. And that can be pretty funny, the way that fear can just override everything else in our mind. And we just react out of instinct. But sometimes it's not so funny because it takes us away from our God if we're not too careful. So fear is powerful, but there is something that is more powerful than fear. John tells us about it. In 1 John chapter 4, verse 18, there is no fear in love. Because he says, perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love casts out fear. It gets rid of it. It destroys it. And of course, perfect love is the kind of love that we find only in God. It's the kind of love that we learn only from God. God's love, perfect love, casts out fear. You know, that's the love that you were made for. You were made to live in that love, for that love to be poured into you and to be poured out through you to others. You were designed for that love to wash away any need for fear to be within you. How does perfect love cast out fear? Why does it work? Well, as I said, fear is a survival instinct. It is part of what keeps us safe. But when we recognize that God's power and His perfect love is for us, then we recognize that our survival is dependent on Him. And so when our survival instinct is triggered, when fear rises up, if we have our mind set on Him, then that fear should drive us into His arms rather than lead to anxiety about how will I fix this on my own. It drives us into His arms. And so perfect love casts out fear. And so Jesus asks Peter, why did you doubt? And the reason is because fear overwhelmed his perspective for a moment. He lost sight of what he really should be focused on. But why was he afraid? Where did that fear come from? Well, one of the sources, and I think possibly the source here in this story, is false expectations. False expectations. False expectations have a way of really letting us down. Humans have a unique ability. Unlike other creatures that God has created, humans have the ability to imagine a future that is different from the one that we are currently in. No other creature in all of God's creation can do that. We can use our imaginations to project a hypothetical future. It's an amazing gift, really. But sometimes we use it to create these if-then scenarios, and we can torment ourselves wondering, like, what's going to happen? And if this happens, then this will happen. And if this happens, then this will happen. And what if that happens? And what if there's something I haven't thought of? We have all these if-then scenarios that we then develop into expectations. Well, if I do this, then this will happen. And we can sometimes bring those if-then scenarios into our relationship with God. Those expectations we can place on God. And we can use our own reasoning, our own logic to think, well, if God loves me, if God is all-powerful, then He must do this. And then if He doesn't do that, well, then He must not love me. Or He must not really be there. And we can impose all of these things on God that aren't true. They were false expectations. Those expectations, those if-then scenarios that we create in our minds, they lack so much of the context that God is operating from. All the things that we cannot see, and we are imposing our ways onto Him and forgetting what Isaiah says, or what God says in Isaiah 55, that my ways are not your ways, says the Lord. These false expectations that people regularly have, well, that was one of Jesus' biggest hurdles in His ministry. Because even His own disciples regularly misunderstood Him. They regularly brought their false expectations of if He was the Messiah, then He was supposed to do this. And people even talk this way. You can see it in John chapter 7. They're talking about whether or not Jesus is the Messiah. And somebody says, well, when the Messiah comes, then nobody's going to know where He comes from. And so they have this expectation. Well, if He's the Messiah, then this must be true. And it's based on stuff that they've come up with. And I think that these false expectations is really maybe one of the reasons why Jesus sometimes told people that he healed not to tell anybody. It wasn't that he didn't want people to know he was the Messiah. It's that he knew that they had false expectations attached to that. And he wanted to reveal who he really was before it was revealed to them that he was the Messiah, so that they could have the right understanding of that. Jesus' own disciples, he would talk to them sometimes about their inability to understand what was going on. He would say things like this in Mark chapter 8, verse 17. Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? He's like, don't you remember all the things that I've done? They had these false expectations from time to time. Sometimes they thought they knew what was going on, but they didn't really have any idea sometimes. What does all this have to do with Peter's fear as he steps out onto the water and is walking across it towards Jesus? Well, I wonder what he expected to happen. Like when he got out of that boat, what did he expect that Jesus was going to do? What were the expectations? This isn't the first time, if you read the story of the gospel, this isn't the first time that they've been on that sea, probably in that boat, in a storm. And the last time that this happened, Jesus was with them on the boat. And they woke him up and told him there was a storm. And Jesus gave them a similar rebuke to what he does to Peter here. But at that time, Jesus calmed the storm. He said, "Peace, be still," and the storm calmed down. The waves calmed down. And so I imagine that that's what they expect once they realize that it's Jesus there with them again. They expect, surely, that he's going to do it again. And perhaps Peter expects that when he gets out on the water, that Jesus is going to calm that storm. But this time, Peter gets out there and the storm doesn't stop. Jesus doesn't stop the storm right away. And Peter is standing on waves that are tormenting the boat. And I can imagine that's hard to keep your balance on. And I wonder if this moment was harder than Peter thought it would be. These expectations that he had weren't met. Going towards Jesus, doing what Jesus invited him to do, was harder than he expected. What about you? Is following Jesus sometimes harder than you expect? Is answering his call to faithfully step out into the storm sometimes a little harder than you thought it would be? And so Peter starts to sink into the water. But as soon as he does, he cries out to Jesus. And Jesus immediately, Matthew tells us, immediately, Jesus reaches out and grabs him and saves him. Of course he does. That's what Jesus does. He is the Savior. But think about this. Jesus didn't have to reach out and grab him. Jesus has healed people with diseases from a distance. Jesus was sustaining Peter on the water from a distance only moments before this. He doesn't have to actually physically grab him to save him in this moment, but he does. And I think that what Jesus is doing is giving Peter what Peter needs. Peter has allowed fear to consume him, and he's sinking into the water. He has this moment of doubt, and he doesn't know what he can hold on to, and he needs something to hold on to, and Jesus gives him that. Jesus gives him himself to hold on to. And I think Peter needed that. And then the story goes on here in verse 32. When Jesus and Peter got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." They worshiped him, which, by the way, is the appropriate response on the other side of the storm here, is to worship our God. But let's notice what happens here. Jesus pulls Peter up out of the water, and they go back to the boat, and they get back in the boat, and the wind ceases. The storm ends. There's some encouragement there to recognize that whatever our storms are, storms don't last forever. The storm will cease. The storm here doesn't last forever, but notice something else. It didn't stop right away. It didn't stop when Jesus pulled Peter up out of the water. It only stopped after they got all the way back to the boat, which means that they walked together to the boat in the storm. I think that's an astounding thing to realize, that they walked together all the way back to the boat in the storm. Jesus could have stopped it then, but he doesn't. And this is an important point to realize. Jesus may not take the storm away. Whatever your storm is, you may cry out to him. You may feel like you're in over your head. You're sinking into doubt. Fear has taken over, and you cry out to him. He may not stop the storm. He may not stop it right away. And sometimes when we're in the thick of it, our expectation can be that if God is there, here's the if-then scenarios again. If God is there, or if God cares, then he will calm the storm. He'll make it stop. He'll fix things. But sometimes, even when we make the right choice, even when we call out to him, even when he responds and lifts us up, even when he is with us, he just may not take the storm away right away. Paul went through so many of his own personal storms, if we can call them that. And he was constantly opposed everywhere he went, and he had all kinds of challenges. And he describes in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 one of his challenges that he refers to as a thorn in the side, and people debate what exactly he's talking about. And for our purposes today, it doesn't really matter what exactly it is, just to know that he is tormented by something. And he says this, 1 Corinthians 12:7, to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations. A thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times, he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And what we just need to notice about that is Paul pleading with God to take away the storm, to take away what he is struggling with through this. And Jesus says no. There is a purpose for this storm, for Paul, this thorn. Sometimes Jesus may not take away the storm. The storm can be loud. It can be powerful and scary. But we remember that Jesus is stronger. Jesus is stronger than the storm. And even though Jesus may not immediately remove the storm, he's there. He is there. And that's what happens here in the story with Peter. The storm doesn't stop. In fact, when Jesus pulls Peter up, the situation around them is completely unaffected. The storm rages on. The change that happens is personal. The change that happens is within Peter. It is in how he moved through that storm. You can imagine moving through that storm and he was stumbling, and now Jesus has pulled him up, and I can picture Peter with his arm around Jesus' shoulders and them walking together back to the boat. He is moving through the storm now, holding on to Jesus. And so even though he may not take the storm away, he affects how we move through it. There is a big difference between knowing in our minds that Jesus can take care of us. There's a big difference between that and in the middle of the storm actually trusting him to take care of us. There is a big difference, and often we don't learn it until we're actually going through it ourselves. And as we go through that storm, as we learn from that experience, we grow. And sometimes we can look back on the storms of our lives and we can feel even grateful for the way they shaped us. Now, we may not feel grateful for the circumstances of that storm. Those may always be painful memories, but we can be grateful for the way that God shapes us through those storms, for the way that we come through them on the other side. To return to Paul again, and all of the personal storms that he faced, and all the difficulties and challenges in his own ministry. He writes from prison to the church in Philippians, and he says, I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. And he says in the famous verse, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. And of course, he's not saying, I can do anything I put my mind to, or something like that. He's saying, whatever storm comes my way, if I'm relying on Christ, I can endure it. I can make it through. So, back to Peter. He's still, even after he cries out to Jesus, even after Jesus pulls him up, he's still battling the same waves of the same storm. But now he's able to move through it in a new way because he's not walking alone. The same is true for you. We can endure anything. We can make it through any storm because we don't walk alone. He walks with us. He walks with us. Don't dismiss that as cliche of just Jesus is with you and just dismissed. Hold on to that truth and know that he is with you in the storm. Whatever the storm is that you face right now or that you will face in the future, remember this, that he is with you. The one through whom all things were made is with you. The Jesus who is king over all of creation is with you. He is the one, the most powerful being in existence, holds you up. He is with you and he loves you. I love what the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 13, 5 and 6. He says, God has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? I love that. If we know that our God is with us, we can look at the other things that come at us and say, we won't fear. They can't really do anything to me because my God is with me. And so, why did you doubt? Because fear can overwhelm our perspective, and that fear can be fueled by our false expectations, but we remember to turn to Jesus. Although he may not take the storm away immediately, he can help us to move through it because he walks with us. You know, stepping into the unknown has always been frightening for people. Stepping out into the unknown has always been dangerous and causes fear and even doubt. It's interesting to look at the way that some medieval cartographers drew maps. They would draw maps of the known world, and there were some of them that would put out in the margins, outside of what was the known world, a Latin phrase that translates to, "There be dragons." Out there beyond what we know as the world that we know, out there be dragons. And sometimes they would draw pictures of dragons. And here's an example of a map like that. You can see the dragons that are down here at the bottom. Outside of the known world, there be dragons. But you notice in this is a famous one called the Salter World Map. Out there in that realm, outside of the known world, there's another figure that is over and above all of it. It's Jesus. It's Jesus. And this map is intended to communicate that, yes, out there be dragons, but there also be Jesus. Out there are dragons. Yes, it is dangerous. It is uncertain. We don't know what we're going to encounter, and that can seem incredibly perilous. But look who reigns over it all. And it reminds us that Jesus is there, and he will be with us until the end. So, no matter what storm arises, may we continue to step out toward Jesus in faith. May our fears only push us closer to him. May we lean on him for support, and may we trust in him to walk with us every step of the way.